Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Soledad Pepe Jijon Sidra Wave Natural Processed Ecuador from Moonwake Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And Moonwake, based out of San Jose, California, and this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Cruz Loma, a wash-processed Ecuadorian coffee. And after that review, Moonwake did reach out to us to discuss another one of their offerings. What really propelled our decision to revisit them was this collaboration release with Hydrangea on these Pepe Sidra coffees, as it felt like a great opportunity to revisit both coffee roasters. So we'll see how Moonwake's Pepe turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So this one is listed as light on their website from their offerings. So they do have a fair bit of a spectrum ranging from ultra light to some slightly more developed coffees. But as far as this one goes, you can definitely tell, even with the processing, that it is a very light coffee relative to so many other American coffee roasters. And I can even say, compared to the Hydrangea coffee that we're going to be reviewing, this one does feel a little lighter than that one, though maybe not quite as light as some of the other coffees that we've either had from other American coffee roasters or that we're going to have from them in the future. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and it was definitely on the relatively cleaner side of naturals, as it was offering mostly a yellow fruit forward profile in both citric and stone fruit senses. Relatively tame with a nice bit of sweetness, so that was the initial impression, though given that this coffee is slightly more processed, I definitely had a feeling that we were going to be getting a lot more intensity from it from this point going forward. Day 17 through the Chemex, and it was a pretty similar second impression, as it was offering a slight bit more of the citric aspects with the listed lemon feeling pretty apt. It was offering a slight bit more sweetness once again with a little bit of brightness and texture, so it was well rounded. There was still a slight lacking of the overall cleanliness, which I think is attributed to the overall processing of this coffee. So I would say for the most part, it's been some pretty positive initial impressions. We move on to day 21 as we opted for the April brewer, and there's been a bit more consistency to the cup with a little bit more evenness today, as the citric qualities are a little bit more toned down, with the stone fruit being a bit more sugary and pronounced in the cup. So that was definitely a selling point to me, as the citric qualities that are often attributed to Sidra coffees are the main reason why I'm not as big a fan of Sidra coffees as some of other varietals in general. But having a little bit more of that mango-like stone fruit sense to it did seem to help a little bit. Still plenty of yellow fruits with a slight bit more clarity, so clarity also helps. Enjoyed this day a fair bit more than the first two impressions. Day 24 opted for the V60 with Moonwake's recipe, and Moonwake's recipe is actually not that different from the recipe that we use, as it's only 2 degrees Celsius lower at 94 degrees Celsius for their Nova series. I should note that this is one of their Nova series coffees as well, and this did lead to some mixed reactions, as it wasn't quite as intense with a little bit less clarity as well, because this seemed to lead to a little bit more of a grainy quality, which did hinder the cup ever so slightly. The stone fruit does have a slight fermentiness to it with a little bit more of the citric lemon attribute. So for these reasons, maybe a little less in the direction that I was looking for, as it seemed to take away a little bit from the clarity of this coffee. Day 27 through the Chemex with Moonwake's recipe, and similar sentiments as relative to the previous days. It's a little bit less intense and a little bit less clear, as there's even a slightly fermented berry quality that's reminiscent of natural processed coffees, lending itself to an okay impression on this day as well. So these adjustments we made didn't really seem to help, and given that the coffee was, I would say, trending in a mostly positive direction before that, we decided to go back to that with our day 30 coffee, as we went back to the V60 with the standard recipe, and it was the best it had been up to this point, with a bit more clarity again and better definition to the coffee. And I think that really helped, just more definition to it in general, as it remains pretty consistent in terms of the overall profile to the coffee, with certain aspects being a little bit more intense on other days. So this time we're returning to a little bit more of that stone fruit like sense to it, while at the same time still offering plenty of those yellow fruit aspects, those citric qualities as well. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and I decided that we're going to stick with the V60 from this point going forward, as I continued to get a little bit of the graininess from the Chemex brews on this coffee. It was a little bit more present in this one, with the clarity losing out a little bit as it's structured, but a little bit more of a citric forward profile to it in that regard. Day 37 through the V60, and the cup continues to offer that yellow forward profile, mostly in the fermented mango sense, while it's complemented by the citric qualities and a slight berry natural tone to it. Citric florals and fruit sweetness all around, so very much in line with a lot of the notes that they have listed on here, with some additional aspects to it as well. But that will go ahead and take us into this tasting wheel, so you can see what we're getting. And we have a number of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the finish level 4. So I do have to say, especially when it comes to more processed coffees, obviously one of the most important things and bigger things about them is that they don't reach overbearing status, and I can definitely say that this coffee did keep it toned down, which in itself is always going to be a victory for more processed coffees. So having the finish there at the level 4 is very nice, and I can say that it continued to trend in that yellow fruit sense, and as well it did have a very slight fermentiness to it, which is something we're going to discuss a little bit more, but that was present within the finish, a lot of the reason why I did feel the need to mention that in that aspect. Sweetness, level 4. So no surprise whatsoever, as this one was always going to be on the sweeter side of things, especially given the processing of it, and it did skew a lot more on the sweeter side of things in terms of the fruit qualities, as you can say that there were maybe a little bit more heavy syrupy of a fruit quality within this one, so you're definitely feeling that one right from the onset. Acidity, level 4. This is a pretty bright coffee, especially I think relative to some of the expectations I had had for it going into it, but I think that the overall profile of these coffees, which do tend to be a little lighter, might have played a significant role in it. I'm not entirely sure how pushing this coffee a little bit more might have affected it, because I feel like the brightness was already pretty high on it, and in addition to that, it was already starting to lose a little bit of its structure given the overall processing of it. So level 4 seems like a really good place to put it, as there was just a fair bit of the citric bright qualities to this one, which does lead us into the citrus fruit, level 4. If I recall correctly, I think that they have something along the lines of a lemon meringue listed on here, and I've always said that the main reason I'm not the biggest fan of citric coffees in general is because they do tend to skew a lot of the time in the more citric directions, which I could give or take. Unless it's a very sweet and well-structured citric component, then it's not necessarily going to be my favorite part of coffee. So having it there at the level 4, it's fine by me, but it does skew a lot more in that slightly more bitter citric sense. Stone fruit, level 4. And I was actually thinking about this before going into making this review. Is there coffees these days that are mango forward that don't have a slight bit of a fermentiness to it? Because thinking back, even the Pepe Jijon from Say, which was listed as having mango, had a more fermented mango-like aspect to it. So I'm kind of wondering now if we've kind of reached a point where anything that does have mango isn't necessarily the cleanest. That's kind of the case with this one, because it was a little bit more fermented in that regard. It does have a much more sugary sense to it as well, as the cup in general did have that. So that scores there at that level 4. As kind of mentioned, it's a very sweet and sugary cup, most specifically in those fruit tones. Bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the florals, level 3. So they do have, I think it's yellow florals listed on here, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of that, because it's not something that I experienced too much. I can see citric florals, as I kind of mentioned that the citric qualities in this coffee were pretty abundant for the duration of it. So that being said, there is enough of those to justify pushing this all the way up there to that level 3 mark. Berry fruit, level 3. As I kind of mentioned, that natural quality that seems to be an ever-present quality in almost any natural processed coffee that we're reviewing at this point is much more in that berry sense, and I feel like that was felt in a fermented sense. So for that reason, you can feel a slight fermented berry quality to this one, and it was pronounced enough to bump it all the way up there to that level 3. Body, level 3. I do have to say this one had a fair bit more texture than I might have expected, because once again, I think it's just been the overall experience I've had with Ecuadorian coffees, where they do tend to kind of fall in line between that 3 or 2, depending a lot on the varietal, but also some of the time with the brew method that we're using. This one right here, I didn't exactly know what to make of it because it's a Sidra coffee, but I've had some really light profiled, light bodied Sidra coffees at the same time. This one just a little bit more structure and body to it. And then I think we'll just go into it, the final thing worth discussing, which is the cleanliness at a level 3. And that's going to be the really big one, because what was going to determine how much I enjoyed this coffee was always going to be the clarity of it. And while I really wanted to say that this is a super clean, natural processed coffee, the reality is it is hindered by a couple of we'll say qualities holding it back. Most specifically, that grainy aspect that, while not necessarily quite as prominent and present in the V60, was an ever-present component in the Chemex. It still was felt ever so slightly in the V60 to a significantly less degree. With that being said, given that it was a present quality within the coffee, that slightly hindered it. And then the other thing was the fermenty aspects of it, both in the berry as well as the stone fruit-like sense, as that also held this coffee back from achieving that level 4 in terms of clarity. But we'll still say level 3 is good. I mean, at least when it comes to starting the discussion for how much I enjoy natural processed coffees, level 3 is the bare minimum, so it did reach that mark. And I do have to say, a lot of the time it felt slightly cleaner, though I did feel like this coffee was continuing to trend a little bit more in that direction. At times we were able to get some really nice structure and definition to it, so for that reason it is maybe on the slightly higher side of level 3, definitely relative to other natural processed coffees. But that's the best place I could put that. And as I'm looking at the tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. First thing I want to say, I've actually heard some absolutely wonderful feedback from others about this coffee, as there are so many people that seem to have really enjoyed this one and found so much beauty within it. But as far as myself, I do have to say that it's not my profile sort of coffee, and that's the first place I want to start with on this one. And it's that of the two Pepe coffees that were being offered, the one from Hydrangea sounded a lot more like my type of coffee, as that one is a little bit less processed than this one, and it does offer a profile that's a little bit more in line with my own preferences. This one being much more on the citric forward side of things, and the stone fruit aspect that isn't necessarily my favorite stone fruit aspect is never necessarily going to endear itself to me. And then couple that with the clarity that did not reach the level that I always hope for when it comes to natural processed coffees. For those reasons, it's obviously not necessarily going to be my favorite, but that being said, I did find some really wonderful qualities that were present within this one. It did keep the intensity toned down to a point where it wasn't overbearing, so that's the first place I need to start. Some wonderful sugary and sweet qualities were also present within it in a very fruit-forward coffee, so some really nice attributes to take away, which just kind of lend itself towards the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you don't mind that ever so slight fermentiness that does come from slightly more intense coffees, then I feel like this is a really good place to start with this one, because it doesn't reach the over-the-top heaviness, intensity that a lot of those coffees can offer if you're looking for something that still gives you plenty of intensity, plenty of sweetness, plenty of fruit-forward profiles, while at the same time not overbearing you with an overly sweet, overly intense, and overly long-lasting, just heavy coffee, while at the same time still offering some enjoyable, brighter qualities to it as well. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. And if you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Soledad, Pepe Jijon Sidra Wave Natural Processed Ecuador from Moonwake Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.